Good morning and welcome back. Before we meet today's speaker, I have a small request of you. Sometime this afternoon, I will email you with a request for your participation in the evaluation of this course. I'll send you a web link that will direct you to the Mendoza server and a few questions about what you liked or didn't about this speaker series and what you think we should do next year. That survey will take you less than 5 minutes. I'll need your response before I can submit a satisfactory grade for you. Thanks kindly for doing that. The topic of our final lecture in 10 years hence is terrorism, looking ahead through patterns of the past. Our speaker is the Reverend Edward A. Malloy, CSC. Father Malloy completed his 18th and final year as president of the University of Notre Dame on July 1st, 2005. He now serves as President Emeritus. Father Malloy was elected the 16th President of the University by the Board of Trustees in 1986, having served 5 years as Vice President and Associate Provost. He is a Professor of Theology and has been a member of the faculty since 1974. As President Emeritus, he continues to teach, conducting a seminar for undergraduates each semester, and makes his home in Sorin College on campus. He is the author of more than 50 articles and book chapters, the editor of 2 books, and the author of 6 others. An ethicist by training, he is a member of the Catholic Theological Society of America and the Society of Christian Ethics. During Father Malloy's presidency, the university saw a dramatic improvement in its financial aid resources, in the quality of its campus facilities, and in the diversity of its student body and faculty. It has also fostered its distinctive identity as a Catholic university while gaining the recognition of its peer institutions, Catholic and non-Catholic alike. Father Malloy earned his doctorate in Christian ethics from Vanderbilt University in 1975 and was honored in 1998 there with the establishment of a chair in Catholic studies in his name. He has also been awarded 24 honorary degrees. He has earned a bachelor's and master's degree in English from Notre Dame and a second master's degree in theology in 1969. He was ordained to the priesthood in Sacred Heart Basilica in 1970. Father Malloy is also the author and narrator of a 4-part series for Now You Know Media entitled Terrorism, Counterterrorism, and the Ethics of Warfare. Ladies and gentlemen, if you would please help me welcome Father Monk Malloy.
As a simple courtesy, I would appreciate if you would read the Observer or be online when I'm talking. That's why I passed out the handout. I'm used to both running seminars and teaching large classes. And so when you choose to sit in the last row, when you have empty rows here, I know the temptation. There's a line in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness where he goes progressively into the interior of the Congo and says, the horror. Basically, as he confronts the reality of evil. That gets picked up in the movie Apocalypse Now, about the Vietnam War. The further the movie goes into the interior, the scarier the reality becomes. And of course, that's supposed to replicate the kind of interior journey into the self, where all of us can discover or rediscover our capacity for evil or the participation in evil. On 9/11, this campus, like the rest of the world, had a kind of shocking experience. We did what we usually do here. We eventually gathered in prayer and tried to console one another including the presence of the Muslim Student Association members. We weren't looking for scapegoats. We were just trying to understand the incomprehensible. About 10 days after that, I had a chance to be in my hometown, Washington, D.C., and I stayed in a hotel for a meeting that allowed me to look out over empty Washington Reagan Airport and to see the side of the Pentagon that had been attacked. 40 days out, I was given the opportunity to muck around in the remains of the World Trade Center for 2 days as a guest of the police and fire departments of New York City. I smelled the smells and saw the sights and watched the excavation of the remains of bodies. And I saw the tears on the eyes of those who were there, who lost comrades and friends. And I went to those little shrines that had been established in New York City in various places, where those who were missing had their pictures and very heartrending accounts of what they had meant to the people who were seeking where they might be. Since that time, since 9/11, the United States has been involved, first in Afghanistan and then in Iraq. Western Europe has seen a proliferation of terrorist incidents and claims by security authorities that they have prevented others. We have seen in Indonesia, in Algeria, in Sri Lanka, in Russia or Chechnya, in the Kurdish area of Turkey, and in many other places in the world, manifestations of terror. Suicide bombing, suicide attacks of various kinds. So what I'd like to offer is some reflection, first of all, as a Christian theologian, whether you happen to be Christian or not, because it's actually relevant to the analysis of where we go from here, and why terrorism as a phenomenon is not going to disappear anytime soon, and how the great temptation for Christians, anyway, is to go back to a previous approach to the reality of war and violence, called the Crusade, which was connected to the Inquisition. So, you have little bullet points in here. A quick analysis, theologically first, and then move to the topic of terror explicitly and some of its aftermath. There really have been three Christian approaches to war and violence. If you happen to be in ROTC, then you ought to know these. If you happen to be a voting citizen, you ought to know these. If you're not a Christian, you ought to know what Christians think about these perennial human temptations and problems. For the first 4 centuries, Christians were pacifist, uniformly pacifist. All the great theologians advocated a pacifist position. Why was that? First of all, because it started as a Jewish sect. And the Jews, in the genius of the Roman authorities, weren't allowed to serve in the military. They would have been unreliable. So they were exempt. And so were Christians. But then there was the problem of what soldiers in the Roman army were expected to do. They lived relatively dissolute lives. They couldn't marry. But of course, that reminds us of prostitution being connected to military forces throughout human history. They could be asked in their entry into the military to participate in worship kind of rites relative to the emperor. They might be asked to persecute their fellow Christians. And so there were a lot of disincentives, even for those who were converted after they were already in the military. But the overwhelming reason why Christians were pacifists in the first 4 centuries was because of the teaching of Jesus and the predominance of text about peace and reconciliation and healing and forgiveness. If you compare the Gospels and the teaching of the Gospels with some of the text of the Jewish Scriptures, particularly the historical text in the wars for the conquering of the Holy Land and its defense, it's somewhat like night and day. And so, if you asked somebody from outer space to read the New Testament and ask them where on the spectrum you think Christianity would come out, it would be on the pacifist side. And I say this, I'm not a pacifist myself, but I think we need to pay attention to that witness. On the pacifist side, however, even though there are very strong arguments, and there is that consistent witness in the first part of Christian history, there have always been concerns. One of the ways it gets expressed, what would you do if? This is a way of getting at consistent pacifism. What would you do if somebody were attacking your children, or your home, or your country? Does it have a realistic view of human nature? Is it not a kind of fundamentalist approach to biblical interpretation, making war and peace the central issue of Christian life in the world, as opposed to our theory of economic involvement, or our notion of family life, or our sense of what it means to be a person of integrity in various positions of leadership. After the coming of Constantine, we went from a reality in the Roman Empire in the 4th century where no Christians could serve in the military to eventually only Christians could serve in the military. And Christianity, instead of being an outlier, a kind of minority sectarian group within the Roman Empire, became the dominant presence. And from that time on, the Christian leaders began to see that they had a stake in using the military authority of the secular government to defend the needs and the reality of the church, even its very existence. And so we have St. Ambrose, and then St. Augustine of Hippo, and in the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas. And after the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther and John Calvin. And in the Orthodox tradition, pretty much all of Christianity began, at least in numbers, to embrace one form or another of what's called just war theory. Just war theory was an attempt to be realistic about the reality of evil and of harm doing and of the use of military power against whatever you thought was sacred. It tried to describe the circumstances under which one could go to war in the first place, and then, as that tradition evolved, what kind of guides of conduct ought to exist in regulating the form that war could take along the way. Now, I am an advocate or defender of the just war theory, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this in this early stage of our discussion. But if you look at the outline I provided, we have the criteria in a summary form that evolved over time. Just cause, for example, defense of the country. Legitimate authority, big debates over, especially in the wars of liberation, who was the legitimate authority. Last resort, not something that could quickly be rushed into. Every means of preventing the violence should have been exercised. Right intention, which is something about the mindset of those who participate in war, not out of hatred, but out of a desire to defend justice. And then what got emphasized as wars historically became more destructive, you no longer had armies by hire but you started to have the civilian population being engaged and trained as military. Just think of Napoleon, for example, and the huge loss of life in Napoleon's many wars. And then the increasing destructiveness of various forms of armaments. It meant that what is sometimes called collateral damage, that is the indirect harmful effect of some kind of military engagement, became even more destructive relative to the civilian population. And not simply the loss of life, but also the whole question of the infrastructure. So what just war theory tried to do is to establish certain principles that needed to be defended. Non-combatant immunity is a way of separating out those who are actively engaged in combat from those who are not. Very tricky thing. Proportionality, both qualitatively and quantitatively. How much destruction is going to happen people-wise, property-wise, or morale-wise, let's say the broader cultural heritage of a society, if war is initiated? And if you think there's going to be high levels of destructiveness, why start it or engage in it in the first place? And then humane treatment. No torture, protection for prisoners of war, no demand for unconditional surrender, all of which have been violated to one extent or another in human history. So the just war theory in its strict interpretation is a pretty tough approach to the reality of war. It could be seen as the way in which, under Christian auspices, war has been tried to be contained, the horror of war. In the Middle Ages, for example, they introduced the peace of God, which was certain categories of people being immune, and certain places like churches couldn't attack churches. That's why historically people went to churches and to monasteries to get away from marauding armies or from somebody seeking them out. The truce of God, they tried to say you can't fight on the weekends. You can't fight during Lent. You can't fight during Advent. It was kind of a tricky way of saying, let's try and restrict the horror of war temporarily as well as in terms of the people and the places that should be immune. Now, just war theory, in my judgment, is the closest thing we have to trying to get a handle on restricting the violence and the destructiveness of war. It is very imperfect as a solution. How many wars would satisfy all of the criteria? First World War, Second World War, the American Civil War, Vietnam, Iraq I, Iraq II, Korea. One could make claims. One could debate. What about the use of nuclear weapons at the end of the Second World War? What about the fire bombings of Tokyo or Hamburg? Now, this is on both sides, of course. And there have been horrors and wars wreaked by both sides. The Nuremberg trials were intended as a way of holding the enemies of the Allies accountable for the horrible deeds they committed. And of course, the thing that lingers on, suppose we had lost, and the other side had something comparable to the Nuremberg trials. Would they have been able to find grounds for holding the American or Allied forces responsible for some of the horrible things that we're engaged in? Anyway, the first two realities, and the pacifism and just war continue on. Pacifism has always been a minority phenomenon, historically as it is today. It came to the fore in Notre Dame when I was a deacon in early years of ordination, when the Vietnam War was going on and the draft was active. And many Notre Dame students had moral qualms of conscience about whether they should serve or not. And so I remember very vividly having these intense conversations with students about whether they should declare conscientious objection or flee to Canada or whatever. So there has always been this question about what kind of response is appropriate. But just war theory continues to be the prevailing mode. The third historical phenomenon is the Crusade. And the comparable language in the Islamic community is Jihad. In the 1090s, Pope Urban II, for very mixed motives, probably first of all to find a common enemy because the various tribes of Europe were fighting each other. They were all Christian. And that having a common enemy meant that they could all rally together. And then the overt purpose was to free access to the Holy Land for Christian pilgrims. Seemed like a good thing to do. So the First Crusade started by persecuting the Jews in Europe. And then a peasant army was gathered and they were quickly defeated. Then finally, some of the royalty of the day gathered a group of professional soldiers and they made it all the way to Jerusalem. And when they got there, they decided, they were so angry because people had resisted them along the way, that they killed every Jewish and Muslim man, woman, and child in Jerusalem. That was victory. There were so-called nine regular crusades over 200 years. At first they were about the Holy Land. Later, they were about the Albigensian heresy. They were about the battle between the Roman part of the empire and the eastern part of the empire. So they fought in Constantinople, which has various names in Turkey. And when people look back on the 200 years of conflict that is called the Crusades, most people were appalled. Even the overt purpose was only temporarily achieved. And there were horrors on both sides. They tended, because they saw each other as the spawn of Satan, as unworthy of rational interaction, as untrustworthy, the only way to win was to kill everything and destroy everything. It's like poisoning a well, as a metaphor. That's what crusades were about. And one of the things the crusades spawned was the Inquisition, which went on from the 1200s in some form or another up into the 1800s. It was the Catholic Church's way, or the Christian Church initially, because there weren't any Protestants at that time, their way of trying to go after heresy. False belief, which was thought to be a threat not only to the church, but also to the unity of various European societies. And so, the way they decided to do it, and the popes gave approbation to the practice, was to use torture. And some of you would have seen or read about the rack and all that sort of thing, drawing and quartering, all the ways that they tried to use torture to get people to convict themselves. Then later, one of the results of the Inquisition was the forced conversion of Jews and Muslims. And then because they were forced to convert, they didn't really trust them. So periodically, waves would break out of suspicion about those who had converted. And then they would be subjected to torture. And so you would have this infinite regress kind of situation. Then there were the witch trials. Thousands and thousands of women in Europe were killed because they weren't married, or they were widows, or the people in the neighborhood didn't like them. And the same thing happened in New England, the Salem witch trials. That was part of the legacy of the Inquisition. After the Enlightenment in Western Europe, and the criticism of the Crusade mentality and of the Inquisition's practices Eventually, all of the Christian groups rejected those two options. And it wasn't until secular totalitarian regimes came along, like Nazism and Stalinism, that they became revived in a different kind of way. If you've ever read Arthur Koestler's book, Darkness at Noon, or any of Kafka's novels, where you're presumed or guilty until proven innocent, you know a little bit of the spirit of it. No hope for reprieve. No trust yourself in the reliability of the adjudication system. So you end up with not simply the effect upon the individual of these practices, but when they become commonplace, they terrorize the population in general. After the fall of the communist regimes in certain parts of Europe, they went in and they had access to the Secret Service documents, thinking in particular of East Germany. And they discovered that husbands and wives were reporting on each other, good friends, business colleagues, parents and children, and that the interrogation and the Inquisition kind of tactics, going through mail, listening to phone conversations and so on, were so pervasive nobody had a chance to read it. So what it did, it just created a reign of horror and terror more than anything else. And some excellent movies that recreate that kind of era. So anyway, we had three options for Christians. Why is this important? Because my claim is, after 9/11, the great temptation in the face of terrorism, and especially suicide terrorism, is to return to the practices of the Crusade, mentality of the Crusade, and the practices of the Inquisition. What we're talking about here is horrible. Terrorism is horrible. Who feels inclined to be a suicide bomber? Or how can we understand the mentality that leads to that kind of action, which takes place both under secular and religious auspices? So what I do in here with regard to terrorism is have a definition that's used by the U.S. government. Premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated against non-combatant targets, very important, by subnational groups or clandestine agents, usually intended to influence an audience. Terrorists know what they're doing. They are not capable of gathering an army for traditional warfare. It's a strategy of the minority, the kind of rebel groups, trying to create such fear and insecurity that it calls into question the capacity of the prevailing authority to survive. It elicits, as I say here, fear, dread, angst, ennui, and horror. That's a pretty good list. Preferred by the militarily weak and combating the militarily strong. Now you can go back in human history. Even in the time of Jesus, the Sicarii were a group of Jewish rebels against the Romans. They used to go up and stab them, kill them in public places, knowing they were going to get killed because they would be caught. And they didn't care, because what they were trying to do is call into question the legitimacy of Roman authority in Israel. In the 12th century, the Shiite branch of Islam used terrorist tactics against the Sunnis that were the dominant group. And they engaged in similar kinds of behavior. During the 19th century, there were so-called anarchist groups, and they did much of the same. Why did they do it? You ask an anarchist, what are you into? Disrupting society because it's unjust. What kind of answer do you have for making a better society? I don't know. It's just better to create uncertainty and stir the pot rather than having some pre-given answer. And so anarchists were very scary people. Joseph Conrad's novel, The Secret Agent, really captures the mindset of that particular time of history. But it's not until the 1960s that you begin to have a manifestation of modern terrorism. And it took place all over the world. The Sendero Luminoso group in Peru, Shining Path. You had the Tupamaro guerrillas in Uruguay. You had the Red Army in Japan. You had the Red Brigade in Italy. You had the Baader-Meinhof gang in Germany. You had the IRA in Ireland. You had the ETA in Spain, and so on. Many of them were secular groups, and they saw a chance to bring, some had dreams of a new society, but they were able, in their time of greatest influence, to really disrupt the ordinary life of people. In order to become a Shining Path member in Peru, you had to kill somebody publicly, and they videotaped it, so you could never leave the group. However, if you look at the evidence, terror groups often disappear because their leadership dies or gets imprisoned, because the movement loses its momentum, because the level of destructiveness becomes counterproductive. And so terrorism, in the 60s version, you can look back with some consolation. Some of those groups aren't around anymore. Now, religious terrorism comes on the scene as a viable entity in the 1980s. Hezbollah, in particular, in Lebanon. And you begin to see the manifestation of what is called suicide attacks. Now, suicide attacks go way back too, as I indicated. But it was the kamikaze pilots during the Second World War, the Japanese strategy. They lost 2,000 pilots and really significantly disrupted the effort to win the war by the American and other navies in the Pacific. If you've ever seen any of those videos on History Channel of the kamikaze attacks, they would go right into the heart of the ship, try and blow it up. Very hard to come back because they were willing to die. The thing about suicide attacks, whether under religious auspices or not, is they're very hard to stop, to combat. And so it was Hezbollah in Lebanon and then Hamas in Palestine, Israel. And they began to be effective. After the Marine group was blown up in Lebanon, America pulled out. Well, it works there. The Black Tigers in Sri Lanka decided to embrace this tactic. And they became the advocates of using women as suicide attackers because they could appear to be pregnant when they carried bombs or the makings of destructive material around their waists. And that is still a preferred way that the Black Tigers have. And so you begin to see the Chechnya Rebels, which are basically a secular group, trying to win independence from Russia or retaliating for the horrible things that have been done to them within the boundaries of Chechnya. You see a group of the Kurds, one of the aspects of the Kurd attempt to have a nation versus the Turks. That's pretty secular too. And as you trace all of this, all of a sudden on the scene comes Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Most people, the average citizen, had never heard of Osama bin Laden or Al-Qaeda as a group. But all of a sudden, they began to get some attention from the securities, American intelligence, and other groups. And there were a series of bombings, simultaneous hits on America's embassies, the blowing up of the USS Cole after they had missed blowing up another ship before that by a series of mistakes. And then after 9/11, and all of the intelligence that allowed us to discover who was involved in the actions of 9/11, then our consciousness was raised, so to speak. And we recognized the reality of radical Islam, the Wahhabi cult in Saudi Arabia, the sect, which became the dominant group, and the very confused relationship that the United States has with various predominantly Muslim societies. One could easily argue that Saudi Arabia is one of the most corrupt countries in the world because of the oil money and the royal family and the distribution of influence and perks. And at the same time, Saudi Arabia was the home base of a number of the people involved in the 9/11 attacks. In Islam, there is a distinction between the great jihad and the minor jihad. The great jihad is the personal attempt to live a holy life in the 5 pillars of Islam, very comparable in all great religious traditions to the path to holiness. But the minor or lesser jihad is the fight on behalf of the faith. And so what is invoked in radical Islam, one of the sources of terrorist activity in the world today, is this use of the Quran to suggest that one can be called to fight either for purification of pre-existing Muslim countries like Saudi Arabia or Lebanon, which is arguably either Christian or Muslim, or Algeria or whatever. And there is a great debate within radical Islam today about whether the priority ought to be to purify pre-existing Muslim countries or to go after the satanic West with all of the nudity and sexual immorality and so on that it is identified with. So, one of the arguments about why we have not had another attack within the continental United States since 9/11, you could argue security's intervened, we got them fighting over there instead of here. You could also argue that it's because a lot of attention is being given to radical Islamic groups in the purification of Islamic countries before trying to take on the West, or whatever the West represents. And in fact, the groups that have been caught in Spain or Britain are probably homegrown. They are the ones who got the message, but were hard to discern because they were brought up within that system, that country, and its culture. Now, I could talk about all these things a lot more, but let me turn quickly to the question of torture. Torture was used. Torture was used in the Inquisition. But in the subsequent conversation, in international law, in Christian theology, in the teaching, in the Catholic tradition of the popes, there has been a strong consensus about the absolute rejection of torture. I want to distinguish torture from interrogation, intelligence work, and a lot of other legitimate ways of preventing harm from being done or holding people accountable for what they did or for what they're planning to do. The evidence is overwhelming, I believe, that torture does not work. That it is not an effective way of getting access to the truth. And that as the means of torture have been refined, the physical, psychological, and pharmacological ways that you can try to intimidate and get information from people, none of that is reliable. And although there may be occasional jewels that are gained, that both the torturer and the tortured are demeaned, their dignity is called into question, and it is a fundamental violation of justice. The United States did two things after 9/11 that I think are questionable, among others. In the reaction or the attempt to thwart international terrorism, which is horrible and which is a legitimate thing to be worried about, and that was a preemptive war and the use of torture. Torture is obviously has been used in Abu Ghraib, in Guantanamo, in rendition, that is, sending captured, suspected terrorists to countries where torture is widely practiced so you can kind of be one step removed. We did it. It ought to stop. Waterboarding is torture. Goes back to the Middle Ages, and it's a different name. And anyone who doesn't think torture is horrible, volunteer to be tortured. Let yourself come forward and let them do to you, and then write a little class evaluation at the end. I suspect you wouldn't want to have to go through that step. I have friends of mine who have been tortured. They have described what it did to them forever. How they wake up in the middle of the night. How hard it is for them to be comfortable sexually, because many of them are sexually abused. What it's like it's not the physical scars so much as the psychological scars. In a lot of assessment of who ends up being asked to be torturers, suggest comparable kinds of things. Although there may be a certain personality type, like the ones that worked in the Nazi concentration camps, that could go home, that could do all these horrible things, and then go home to their wife and children, and act as if nothing happened. So what I'm calling for in my appraisal, and I'm happy to talk about any of this, I'm not here to sell tapes, but this CD tape that I produced does all of this stuff in great detail, if you're interested. My conclusion is this. As far as Christians are concerned, there really are only two viable alternatives. Pacifism, which is a very difficult route to be consistent on, or just war. And just war, as I would like to see it, is a very demanding approach to the reality of war. But it also is a way of holding people accountable after the fact for misdeeds. And it is a way of trying to induce the expression of conscience as part of one's responsibility in the military or in civilian leadership. The horrible thing about the torture is that it was ordered or approbated by the civilian authority. And so in a sense, some of the military that have been convicted for doing things at Abu Ghraib, did any top commanders get convicted? No. It was only the ones that were actually with videotapes that got some kind of a punishment. I don't think that's all the way it ought to work. The people ought to be held responsible that authorized it in the first place. It violates international law, it violates Christian teaching, and it ought to be abandoned. This is a horrible topic to talk about, but it's not going to go away. 10 years from now, there will be terrorist activity. There will be fear. Suppose a terrorist group gets access to nuclear, bacteriological, or chemical warfare capacity. Dershowitz, the Harvard law professor, may have heard of. He's very sympathetic to the reality of Israel. And so he's tried to develop approaches to these topics that respect the law, the value of the law, and especially international law, but still give some wiggle room. And so he has this set of scenarios that he plays out in his teaching. Suppose you discover what you think is a terrorist group in New York City. They have a nuclear bomb. They demand the city be evacuated. The only way you can find out potentially where the bomb is to torture one. Would you torture? I've asked this question to my classes, and initially most of them were opposed to torture. Give them that scenario. Oh, yeah, sure. And the argument is because you prevent a greater horror from happening. But of course that scenario is a false scenario. There's never been an example even close to that. And it isn't really focusing our attention on the once-in-a-lifetime case. It's focusing our attention on the ordinary things that go on all the time. If you read the newspaper, the active war in Sri Lanka, with the military going in and trying to kill as many Tamils as they can on one side, and the Tamils just blowing up anybody indiscriminately goes on. It's a horrible war. I've been there. Wonderful people, but still there are limits to what you can expect in terms of resolution. They had a peace period going for a while that Norway, I think, was involved in trying to mediate. The IRA is a good example, and its Protestant counterparts in Northern Ireland. Peace reigns in Northern Ireland. Although the IRA and some of their counterparts engaged in some horrible activity, the effect of international pressure from the United States and Britain in particular, and the Republic of Ireland, was sufficient to make the case. ETA in Spain only periodically comes out. What's interesting is there are no, as far as I know, Christian groups, or those that have Christian culture in their background, who engage in suicide bombing. Suicide bombing has been, or attacks of various kinds, have been a phenomenon either of secular groups or some other religious groups. So it's a very puzzling question about what the future is going to look like. So I don't want to minimize the risk and the reality and the horror, to go back to my initial comment. But we need to be thoughtful. We need to maintain our moral compass, our framework of analysis. And we need to ask hard questions of ourselves so that we don't end up being like that which we hate. Of course, that's the ultimate temptation. We end up becoming like that which we oppose. And if nothing else, the residue of just war theory has been designed to try to remind us that our former enemies, that is speaking as American, like the Japanese and the Germans and the Italians, are our allies. And our former allies, for a long time, that is the Russians, are now at least in a somewhat cordial relationship. The problem is, if you get into the crusade mentality and you write off whoever it is, whatever category people they belong to, you end up making it even more difficult for détente to settle in, for peace to come, and for a new set of possibilities to emerge. And if you read human history, you can't let that happen, because there's always a kind of reformulation of who your friends are and who they aren't. Let's open it up. I'm used to running seminars. There's a couple of faculty plants here who I understand always come forward if no students do. But I really would like some of you students to ask me something that you think is relevant, or something you'd like further comment, or test the things that I've said. It's your world. You're going to have to deal with this reality for your foreseeable future. Anyone?
You mentioned international law a few times. I was hoping you could discuss briefly the International Criminal Court and similar tribunals, and how the structure and purpose of these institutions kind of align with Christian perspectives.
In The Hague, there is a court that has been established. One of its functions has been to hold accountable some of those involved in the horrors of the former Yugoslavia. And somewhat like the Nuremberg trials, but on the basis more of a greater level of neutrality, they've tried to weigh the evidence and not only hold people accountable, but figure out what would be an appropriate penalty. In various parts of the world, there are comparable groups. In Latin America, there's a group. And I think that international law has a real role to play, but it has the dilemma. One is, not everybody agrees with the foundational principles upon which it is based, or is open to claims about that it's anything more than a kind of temporary common sense consensus that could be changed in the future. Natural law theory, for example, which a lot of Catholic social teaching has come out of, makes fundamental claims about the nature of humanity, about human beings before God, about the nature of society, and tries to, on the basis of certain principled claims, then suggest what is unacceptable human behavior. International law has perhaps some reference to that, but is not necessarily based upon that. The second problem with international law is not everybody, all the great major actors in the world, agree to be held accountable to it, including the United States. Because we're afraid, maybe some are afraid, that it'll be a get-even time. And as the last of the great superpowers, that the rest of the world will go after our various ventures, and we're not willing to give up people. Suppose the court in The Hague wanted to hold Donald Rumsfeld accountable for torture in Iraq, because he approved it, or somebody else, but let's just to pick him for the moment. There's no way in hell that the United States is going to surrender Donald Rumsfeld to The Hague, to the court. And so that's another dilemma. If not everybody is equally open to its ministration, it's going to be that much more complicated for it to be consistent and apply to everyone equally. I think the United Nations, various international agencies, and the international courts all have a role to play, but they have complications as well. Of course, in the end, who sits in the court? What training do they have? What do they appeal to? Is always going to be debated. Yes, somebody else. Yes. You got to get a mic. Wait till the mic comes.
Thank you. Talking a little bit more about the conflict in the Middle East.
Right.
You mentioned here the Palestinian terrorist groups, Hezbollah, for instance, and Hamas. I think that these groups are contributing to the violence. The last thing that they are doing is bringing peace to the conflict. So I really reject what they are doing. But in the other side, you have the Palestinian society, the people there that are living, in infrahuman conditions. Mm-hmm. They are now trapped in a wall. So my question is, do you think that these people are also victims of terrorism?
I happen to have spent a fair amount of time in the Middle East, particularly in Palestine, Israel. I've read a lot about it. I've listened to a lot of so-called experts speak, both there and here. And so at least every time I go, I feel more ignorant. I mean, the complexity of any place is a constant reminder. If you think you know a lot, you really don't. But at least you try and make sense of what's going on there. Notre Dame's had a program, of course, that's allowed people to experience that firsthand. And a lot of the students who participated in Tantour have come away transformed in terms of the way they see the world. There's no doubt that if a society is just and equitable, has democratic access to power, and has a self-confidence about it, that terrorism simply won't flourish. There may be an isolated kind of crazed group, like blew up the building in Oklahoma City or something, but they're not going to be representative and have a long life. But when you have inequity that's structural and long-standing, like you have in Palestine, and when you have a dispute that in some ways goes back millennia, and memories that are long-lasting about things that happened 500 years ago, it's very difficult to find enough common ground. Just reading the paper this morning, the efforts by various international actors, including Condoleezza Rice, our graduate, as Secretary of State, or Jimmy Carter, trying to find some way of making a breakthrough in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. You have the constant settlement in Palestine of these Israeli group, these people who want to live and have their own very nice house up on hills. And you have the impoverishment in the camps. And you have people shooting rockets into Israel. You have the Israelis in helicopters blowing up cars and people and collateral damage and so on. This is going on. It tends to breed cynicism, despair, but we can't let that be the case. I have been in Palestine and in Israel when it was peaceful. And you see what it means for the common people, for family life, for companies, for the farms and all the things, the tourist business, all of which are necessary for the economic prosperity of that region. But that's not unlike other parts of the world. I mean, in the end, is Iraq one country or three countries? Has Afghanistan ever been a central reality? Has anybody ever conquered Afghanistan? Not as far as I know. But maybe it really isn't a country. Maybe it's a set of tribal prerogatives. And then you have, in various parts of Africa, where you have Muslim, Christian, and animus, like Sudan, and the horrors that go on in certain other parts of the world that sometimes we neglect to pay attention to. They are fostered by the poverty and the despair, particularly of the youngest generation. In studies of who becomes suicide bombers, it's interesting. A lot of people think it's only the ones that are drugged up or never had a chance or something. Most of the suicide bombers have been very thoughtful, family-oriented, true believers who felt they had no other way to express their sense of frustration and failure. The ones who did 9/11 were pretty much, some had doctorates, they were well educated. As a group, they were well educated. Anyway, to go back to the question of Palestine-Israel, I wish I had an answer. But descriptively, what you say is accurate. Hamas and Hezbollah and other groups, the PLO, have all operated on the grounds that this was an oppressed people, this is the argument, and that they needed someone to represent their interest and needed to lash out in order to get world opinion turned in their favor. So, thus, terrorism in its various forms. And until there is a kind of willingness to address all of those levels of problem, it's going to be hard to have a sustained period of peace. And that's true, I think, every place in the world where terrorism has prevailed. Except for that version of the lesser jihad that wants to lash out at the West for all it represents rather than the gaining of territory. Get out of our world, go back to your own. I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm trying to go at it a little bit. Yes, who else? Now, I'd love to go first in the... Yeah, go right here. Yeah.
I don't think I need a mic.
It's okay, go ahead.
You talked about just war, and there is 2 points in that. One was the proportionality and the non-combatant.
Relative to moral means, yeah.
Right. Now, with the modern warfare, there is no way you can avoid collateral damage.
Right.
That is one thing. The second thing is, also with the modern warfare and the weapons, that some countries have more than the others, some countries have more damaging weapons than the others, as, for example, the nuclear war, weapons. How are you going to propose that proportionality? How are you going to even the playing field? It doesn't happen.
One of the things that happened because of negotiations between the Soviet Union at the time and the United States in the SALT talks was to try to reduce the number of nuclear weapons around the world. And I've been to the Ukraine, and when I talked there to some of the American representatives, our Senator Lugar, among others, was very active in proposing in the Senate funding to de-escalate the level of nuclear armaments around the world. So the Ukraine basically de-escalated entirely from the presence of nuclear weapons on its territory. There has been a willingness on some of the early nuclear powers to do the same. But now the problem is the proliferation question. So if India has it, Pakistan has to have it. Israel clearly has the bomb. North Korea has the bomb. One of the claims that was made about going into Iraq was Saddam Hussein was going to foster the possession of weapons of mass destruction. I have no doubt that at some time he would have intended to do that if he could, but in fact he had chosen under a lot of pressure not to go in that direction, and that ended up being a bogus claim for going to war against Iraq. But that there are efforts by terrorist groups to get access to ABC weapons is accurate. And that would be the worst case scenario for what they could do. So on one hand, you have nations that are neighbors or historical enemies wanting to balance off nuclear capacity against each other. And so North Korea can say they're doing it because of South Korea or because they're surrounded by enemies. And then China can say, we're not happy about North Korea having nuclear weapons. We would like them to bargain for food and get rid of their weapons. Maybe they will someday. Ideally, the world would be a lot safer place if there were none. Once you have the knowledge, of course, you could always move in that direction again. After the horrors of the First World War, with mustard gas and other things, nations agreed, as part of their armaments, not to have certain kind of weapons like that, like mustard gas. And generally, we've been very quiet, the world's been very quiet about what kinds of chemical or bacteriological capacity exists. There's been a lot more focus on the nuclear. And what's interesting is anthrax. Remember all the anthrax attacks in Washington? Nobody's ever been charged. Certain suspects were listed in the public. So what do we think of that? Why don't we know who did the anthrax? And are they lurking out there waiting to attack again? And then we had that Japanese cult that set off certain substance in the subway, and they were captured. But it was a reminder. If I wanted to be a terrorist, relative to the question, I could create havoc in the United States with low technology terrorist attacks in malls in 22 minor cities, or at the Super Bowl, or, not even a big event like that. So the fact that we've been able to know the piece that didn't have that included, and much of the world has known that, God willing, that will prevail. And we can find methods of limiting the expansion of those kinds of weapons, a de-escalation by those who have them, and a greater international consensus about why it would be foolish to go in that direction. There's a phrase that was coined during the debates in the conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States in the West, the rationality of irrationality. The argument was, we possess sufficient nuclear weapons that if they attack us first, to destroy their society. So instead of just targeting the military, we target their civilians. They target our civilians. It would be irrational to ever use them because both societies would be destroyed. And so one of the arguments for those who consider Ronald Reagan a great president was not only that he outspent the Soviets, but he led to a situation where the rationality of irrationality was convincing. Now that's one interpretation, not one that I necessarily agree to, but it's one way of thinking about how we avoided after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, no more use of nuclear weapons. God willing, we would know no more use of bacteriological or chemical weapons either. But the existence of terrorist groups and their capacity to get access to those things is a good reason why this is not going to go away. Another question. We're in the home stretch. I'd love to go in the back row back there and start asking you guys questions.
I was wondering if you could talk about the role of energy, especially as gas prices are rising quite
The role of
rapidly
energy,
on
yeah.
future conflict, and whether we'll see more.
The role of energy. I talked to General Jones, that's his name, right? That spoke to this group. He came over and visited with me before, and he told me a little bit about what he's trying to develop as a consensus about energy. Well, a lot of futurologists have talked about what are the top things in the world that one could fight over. Number one is water. No water, no life. Just remember, no water, no life. So if you live in Phoenix or Tucson, get rid of water, you're all moving out. If you live in Las Vegas, no water, you're gone. Los Angeles, you're gone. If you live by Lake Michigan, you're okay. Just filter the water. But water's number one. Oil, presently, is number two. Or food. Food, now we're seeing the scarcity of food is a huge issue too. But I think that the energy question is related to all the things that we need international consensus on. And so, since we presently use a good percentage of the world's energy, we need to be very aware of that. And recognizing that China and India, the two largest countries in the world, are increasing the quality of life very rapidly and are going to make much greater demands on energy. One of the ways we're going to see the threat of war in those parts of the world like Africa, where there are untapped or available resources, in places like Nigeria, a lot of pressure from countries like China and India to get access to that. I'm very involved in Australia, and Australia is a tremendous source of minerals, of natural gas, and to a lesser extent of oil. And anybody who's looking at the next 10 or 20 years of the world is going to want to have a good relationship that is in a positive way, or going to have a kind of envious eyes about controlling those other parts of the world that have greater access or greater supply. So I don't have wise things to say about energy beyond the people that have talked to you already, but that is going to be lingering on as a huge worldwide issue, and that people could fight. That goes to what I'm talking about. Could fight for access. Many of the wars was about access to natural resources. Why did the colonialist era, where England and France and Portugal and Spain go and try and conquer the New World, which included a big hunk of the world as we know it? Why did they do that? Well, part of it was a sense of adventure, but access to natural resources. And so energy could be one of the grounds upon which wars... Why are we in Iraq? What's the number one reason why we're... Suppose there was no oil in Iraq. Will we be there? Suppose there was no oil in Saudi Arabia. Will we be there? I doubt it. Now, don't be cynical about that. Oil's important. This society would ground to a halt without access to energy. But we need to be honest about at least some of the motivation for some of the horrible things that have happened. We are there. Osama bin Laden, his first complaint was American military forces in Saudi Arabia. You read his early rants, that was the number one issue. American military. Why were we there? Because of matters related to protecting one of the great natural resources for energy. One or two and we'll call it quits. Anybody else? You have somebody back there, I think.
Would the concept of preemptive strike, which is at the heart of the Bush doctrine, ever satisfy the just war theory? It seems that it wouldn't, because it would necessarily not satisfy the last resort element of the analysis. So I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Let me use this as a jumping point for another comment. You can agree with this or not. President Bush hosted the Pope. The Pope has been very critical of President Bush about the preemptive attack, about the torture, and about the whole set of realities that are roiling international life in that part of the world. Yet he allowed himself to be accepted, spent time, had many pictures taken for peace and prosperity and whatever, a lot of good things, for a defender of fundamental values. So the next time somebody says that someone who is criticized on one aspect shouldn't be allowed to come to a Catholic university because there's one aspect of what they represent, we might want to at least look at the Pope's overture. He had a private meeting. He clearly wanted to try and change President Bush's mind about a few things, but also agreed with him on many others. It was a person-to-person, but it was also a symbolic gesture. I think that was the right thing for him to do. He could easily have said, I've criticized him. As long as the war is going on, as long as this is going on, I'm not going to visit with him. But I think he chose the right path. And it's something that I think is an interesting lesson for some of the debates that occasionally go on in the American body politic relative to the church. The Pope and that's just because he's the Pope, I think just war doctrine, as it has evolved, means that preemptive war is not acceptable. It doesn't mean that you can't stop attacks that you are mobilizing. I mean, if you're going to accept the use of violence, there are circumstances where the use of violence and the information is reliable and so on. But this kind of preemptive attack, whether some convinced the authorities to be on false evidence is another question. But it was entertained as a kind of preemptive attack. I do not think that is compatible with just war teaching. But like a lot of just war teaching, when there's been violation of one of the clauses or another, it doesn't mean it falls apart, and it doesn't mean you cease the moral analysis or the conversation in goodwill. People of goodwill can disagree, including advocates of just war teaching. And people who are pacifists can still like the active engagement of just war thinkers and advocates because they recognize that it's a way of trying, if nothing else, to limit the scale and the damage of the violence that we sometimes engage in. But my answer is I do not think it's compatible. Let's do one more question. We'll call it quits. Anyone up there? Anybody up here? How about, okay, right there.
What do you think the role of the Catholic Church will be in the future based on these issues? You've talked a lot about sort of theoretical, moral theories and things. Is there more of that, or maybe more specific efforts? I guess, can you just talk a little bit about that?
When I was president, I used to be asked, why do you let ROTC be on Notre Dame campus? Because I think it's a good thing to have ROTC. Why did you used to speak in the annual ROTC convocation where they march before you, march in review? Because I thought that it's important to have people in the military who are brought up in a good value system, who are acquainted with the demands of Christian teaching about war and peace, and who can be people of conscience, who can say in the military or outside of the military that some things are simply unacceptable. And if I believe that, and I'm going to pay a price for it, so be it. I think the same thing. I'd like to see more Notre Dame people who are Catholics, but of course others who are not, run for political office. I'd like to see a Catholic Notre Dame graduate president of the United States. We've had 2 heads of state in Panama and Costa Rica. No reason we can't have a president, or people that are like Condoleezza Rice, who's in a cabinet position. We've had governors and senators and mayors and so on. I think the political order and the military and the police agencies and I haven't said anything about CIA, NSA, all of these groups that are also part, and sometimes in an unregulated way, which is, I read enough espionage literature, stories to know, and there's been enough revelation from former agents about some of the things that go on separate from the military, which are problematic as well. But I think the Catholic Church, if it's doing its job, first of all, needs to regain its moral authority. We've had a terrible period of time with the sexual abuse crisis, sometimes with financial mismanagement and other things. Hopefully we're on the way back from that. But I think the Pope and the bishops and others, theologians and Christian lay people, need to be able to take what they believe, what they profess in their worship, into their everyday life and into the roles that they play in society, including their voting patterns. And I would hope that the Church could influence that, could engage in an ongoing conversation about why these issues are so important. My version of Christianity or of Catholicism isn't prayer and then it's the real world. You know, Sunday is one thing, but the rest of the world is Machiavellian or something. I don't accept that. I think we are called to take our values and concretely in business, in the professions, in education, in the military, in politics, whatever, and translate them as best we can. We'll make mistakes. We won't always be consistent. But if not us, then who? And that's why the whole notion of a Christian calling, to feel when you go off into the world as graduates, that I'm called to do something transformative, something dramatic, something important with my life. And that what I pray about and what I've been passed on to me and what I've learned in reflection while I've been here ought to charge the kind of things that you do from now on in your family life, in your parenting, in your citizenship, and in the role you play in whatever job you have. That's what I think the Church ought to do. God willing, more of you, as many of the graduates. I've done a number of Notre Dame clubs recently. I'm always very admiring of what's going on, what these people are doing, former students of mine, people I've married. They're really living good lives, and I'm very inspired by that. And I hope, God willing, you all will too. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Father. I know you have no end of neat Notre Dame stuff in your office. Here's the jewel in the crown. It's a Mendoza mug. And I know you're going to get good use out of this. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students of Mendoza School, thank you very much, Father.
Thank you very much.